The morning started like any other for Rachel Torres. She woke up at dawn, made herself a strong cup of coffee, and checked the weather forecast one more time. Everything looked perfect. Clear skies, calm waters, and just enough wind to make sailing pleasant. She was a marine biologist, and today she was heading out on a solo research trip to study coral reefs off the Indonesian coast. At 29 years old, Rachel had been doing this kind of work for almost 6 years. She loved the ocean more than anything else in the world. As a child, she would spend hours at the beach watching the waves and collecting shells. Now she got paid to understand and protect the underwater world she loved so much. Her job was to document how the coral reefs were doing, take water samples, and photograph any changes she noticed. Her boat was small but reliable. She had checked everything twice the night before. Life jackets, emergency flares, radio equipment, first aid kit, and enough food and water for 5 days. Her colleagues at the research institute thought she was being overly careful, but Rachel believed you could never be too prepared on the ocean. The sea was beautiful, but it could turn dangerous in minutes. She untied the ropes from the dock at 7 in the morning. A few local fishermen waved at her as she steered her boat toward the open water. She waved back, feeling that familiar rush of excitement. There was something special about being alone on the ocean, just her and the endless blue. No traffic, no crowds, no noise except the sound of waves and seabirds. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. Rachel dove at several spots, taking photos of the coral formations and collecting samples. She filled her research journal with notes and observations. At night, she would anchor her boat, eat a simple dinner, and watch the stars. The sky was so clear out there, far from city lights. She could see thousands of stars, maybe even millions. It made her feel both tiny and connected to something bigger than herself. On the third morning, things started to change. Rachel noticed the air felt different. Heavier somehow. The water was unusually calm, almost too calm. She checked her weather radio and frowned. There was a storm system developing, but it was supposed to stay far to the north. Still, something felt off. She had been on the ocean enough times to trust her instincts. She decided to start heading back toward the coast. Better safe than sorry. But within an hour, the sky began to darken. Clouds rolled in faster than she had ever seen. The wind picked up suddenly, going from a gentle breeze to strong gusts that rocked her boat. Rachel quickly secured all her equipment and put on her life jacket. Her heart started beating faster. The storm hit with terrifying speed. One moment she was preparing for rough weather, and the next moment she was fighting to keep her boat steady. Waves that had been gentle swells turned into walls of water. Rain poured down so hard she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. The wind howled like a living thing. Rachel grabbed her radio and tried to send out a distress signal. Her hands shook as she called for help, giving her coordinates and explaining the situation. The radio crackled with static. She heard a voice respond, but then the signal cut out. A massive wave slammed into the side of her boat and she lost her grip on the radio. It skidded across the deck and disappeared into the churning water. She tried to steer toward calmer waters, but the storm was too powerful. The boat was being tossed around like a toy. Another huge wave crashed over the deck and Rachel heard a terrible cracking sound. The mast was breaking. She watched in horror as it came crashing down, tangled in ropes and torn sails. Water started pouring into the boat. Rachel knew she had to act fast. She grabbed her emergency kit, the waterproof bag she always kept ready. Inside was a life raft, some basic supplies, water purification tablets, a knife, and a few energy bars. Her hands moved on autopilot, doing what she had trained for but never thought she would actually need. She managed to inflate the life raft just as another wave hit. The boat lurched violently to one side. Rachel felt herself being thrown into the water. The cold shocked her system. She surfaced, gasping for air, and saw her boat capsizing just a few feet away. Everything she had brought, all her research, her equipment, her photos, was going down, but the life raft was still floating. She swam toward it with everything she had, fighting against the waves and the wind. Her arms burned with effort. Salt water stung her eyes. Finally, her fingers caught the edge of the raft. She pulled herself up and collapsed inside, coughing and shaking. The storm raged around her for what felt like forever. Rachel huddled in the tiny raft, holding on tight as waves tossed her around. She threw up from the motion and the fear. She had no idea which direction she was going or how far from land she was. The emergency beacon in her kit was supposed to send out a signal, but she had no way of knowing if anyone was receiving it. Eventually, exhaustion took over. Rachel drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes waking to more rain, sometimes to brief moments of calm. The sun would appear and disappear behind clouds. Day turned to night and back to day again. She had no sense of time anymore. Back on the mainland, the Indonesian Coast Guard had received her broken distress call. They immediately launched a search operation. Helicopters flew over the area where she had last reported her position. Boats combed the waters. Her family was contacted. Her mother broke down crying. Her father insisted she must be alive, that Rachel was smart and strong and knew how to survive. The search teams found pieces of her boat floating in the water, a life jacket, some equipment, bits of broken wood. But there was no sign of Rachel. The ocean was vast, and the storm had scattered debris across miles of open water. After 3 weeks of searching with no trace of her, the official decision was made. The search was called off. Rachel Torres was declared lost at sea. Her family held a memorial service on the beach where she had learned to love the ocean as a child. Her colleagues shared stories about her passion for marine life and her dedication to protecting the reefs. People left flowers at the dock where she had last departed. Everyone believed she was gone, another tragic reminder of how powerful and unpredictable the ocean could be. But Rachel was not gone. She was alive, barely, drifting on currents she could not control, heading toward a place no one knew existed. Rachel opened her eyes but couldn't tell if it was day or night. Everything hurt. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin felt like it was on fire. She tried to sit up in the tiny raft, and every muscle in her body screamed in protest. How long had she been drifting? 2 days? 3? She had lost count. The emergency kit was still strapped to her side. With shaking hands, she opened it and found a small bottle of water. She wanted to gulp it all down, but she forced herself to take only tiny sips. She had no idea when she would find more water. The energy bars were soggy from seawater, but she ate one anyway. It tasted like cardboard and salt, but her empty stomach needed something. Then she saw it. Land. At first, she thought she was hallucinating. She had been seeing things that weren't there for the past day or so, mirages created by her dehydrated brain. But this time, the image didn't disappear when she blinked. There was actually an island ahead, small and covered with green vegetation. Palm trees swayed in the breeze. Rachel tried to paddle toward it using her hands, but the current was stronger. The raft drifted sideways, and for a horrible moment, she thought she might miss the island completely, but luck was finally on her side. The current pushed her toward the beach, and the raft scraped against sand. She practically fell out of it, crawling onto solid ground. She lay there for a long time, just feeling the sand beneath her. Solid ground. After days of being tossed around on water, it felt like the most wonderful thing in the world. She wanted to cry, but she was too dehydrated for tears. Instead, she just breathed, feeling grateful to be alive. When she finally had the strength to stand, Rachel looked around. The beach was small, maybe 100 feet of white sand. Behind it was thick jungle vegetation. She could hear birds calling and insects buzzing. The island looked tiny, but it was land, and that meant possibilities. Fresh water, food, shelter. The first thing she needed was water. Without water, nothing else mattered. Rachel remembered her training. Islands usually have fresh water from rain that collects in natural pools or streams. She walked into the jungle, pushing through palm fronds and vines. The sun beat down mercilessly, and her vision started to blur. Then she heard it. The sound of trickling water. She followed the sound and found a small stream flowing between rocks. Rachel fell to her knees and cupped the water in her hands, drinking desperately. It was warm and tasted slightly earthy, but it was fresh water. She drank until her stomach hurt, then sat back and cried. This time the tears came easily. The next few days were the hardest of her life. Rachel was weak from her ordeal at sea. She had cuts and scrapes all over her body that were starting to get infected. Her skin was badly sunburned, and she had no medicine, no supplies. Nothing except the small emergency kit. At night, she would curl up on the beach, shivering even though the air was warm. She talked to herself constantly just to hear a human voice. Food became her next challenge. She found coconuts lying on the ground under the palm trees. Getting them open was harder than she expected. In movies, people just smashed coconuts on rocks and they split perfectly. In reality, Rachel spent almost an hour beating one coconut against a sharp rock before it finally cracked. Her hands were bleeding by the time she got to the white meat inside, but it was worth it. The coconut was food and water combined. She discovered shellfish in the tidal pools near the beach. Small crabs, mussels, and other creatures she didn't recognize. Her stomach turned at the thought of eating them raw, but she had no way to make fire yet. She forced herself to eat, gagging at first, but eventually her hunger won. Her body needed protein, and this was the only source available. Making fire became her obsession. Rachel knew the theory. She had seen survival shows where people rubbed sticks together or used flint, but actually doing it was incredibly difficult. She spent hours trying different methods, rubbing sticks until her hands had blisters on top of blisters. Nothing worked. She wanted to scream in frustration. Finally, after 3 days of trying, she noticed something. The clear bottom of a plastic bottle from her emergency kit could focus sunlight. She positioned it over some dry leaves and waited. It seemed to take forever, but eventually, a tiny wisp of smoke appeared. Then a small flame. Rachel carefully added more leaves, then small twigs, then larger pieces of wood. She had fire. That night, she cooked fish she had caught using a makeshift spear. The fish was burnt on the outside and raw on the inside, but it was the best meal she had ever tasted. She sat by her fire, feeling something she hadn't felt since the storm. Hope. But the loneliness was crushing. Rachel had always been independent, comfortable with her own company. But this was different. This was total isolation. No one to talk to, no one to share her small victories with, no one to comfort her when fear crept in at night. She started talking to herself more and more. Sometimes she would have full conversations, answering her own questions in different voices just to feel less alone. She made a calendar by carving notches into a piece of driftwood, 1 notch for each day. It gave her some sense of structure, some way to mark time passing. But there were days when she was too sick or too depressed to remember, and she would lose count. Those were the darkest times when she wondered if anyone was still looking for her, or if the world had already moved on. The island had no large animals that she could see, which was a blessing. But it had plenty of smaller dangers. She learned quickly to watch where she stepped after nearly stepping on a sea snake. The insect bites were constant and maddening. Some of them became infected, and she had to drain them using the small knife from her emergency kit, gritting her teeth against the pain. Rachel's clothes fell apart within the first month. The salt water and sun destroyed the fabric. She was left with just her sports bra and underwear, which also didn't last long. Eventually, she started wrapping herself in large leaves, which felt ridiculous but provided some protection from the sun. There were moments when she thought about giving up. Nights when the loneliness felt like a physical weight crushing her chest. Times when she wondered what the point was of surviving if no one was coming to find her. But something inside her refused to quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the survival instinct that lives in all humans. Or maybe it was the thought of her family, still believing she might somehow be alive. She realized something important during those early weeks. If she kept thinking of herself as someone waiting to be rescued, she would lose hope. The search had probably been called off already. No one was coming. If she was going to survive, she needed to stop waiting and start living. This island wasn't a temporary prison. It was her home now. And if it was going to be her home, she needed to make it livable. The day Rachel decided to build a real shelter was the day everything changed. She had been sleeping on the beach for almost 2 months, using palm fronds as a makeshift blanket. But last night, a sudden rainstorm had soaked her completely, and she spent hours shivering in the darkness. Enough was enough. If this island was going to be her home, she needed an actual home. She started by exploring the island more thoroughly. It was bigger than she initially thought, maybe half a mile across at its widest point. The center had a small hill covered with bamboo plants. Rachel's eyes lit up when she saw them. Bamboo was strong, lightweight, and perfect for building. She had watched enough nature documentaries to know that people in tropical regions had been using bamboo for construction for thousands of years. Getting the bamboo down was harder than it looked. Rachel used a sharp rock she had shaped into a crude cutting tool. It took her an entire day to cut down just 5 bamboo poles. Her arms ached, and her hands developed new blisters, but she kept going. She dragged the poles to a spot near the beach, but sheltered by trees. This would be her building site. The first version of her shelter was basically a leaning roof. She propped bamboo poles against a tree trunk and covered them with layers of palm fronds. It wasn't pretty, but when it rained that night, Rachel stayed dry. She lay underneath her creation, listening to the rain patter on the leaves above her, and smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in weeks. Over the next few months, Rachel improved her shelter bit by bit. She learned through trial and error. Her first walls fell down in a strong wind. Her second attempt at a door let in too many insects. But each failure taught her something. She started weaving palm fronds together more tightly. She used vines to tie the bamboo poles more securely. She dug small trenches around her shelter to channel rainwater away. By her 6th month on the island, Rachel had built something she was actually proud of. Her shelter had walls, a sloped roof that didn't leak, a raised sleeping platform made from bamboo, and a separate area for storing food. She had even created a door using a woven palm mat that she could roll down at night. It wasn't a house, but it was definitely more than a hut. Food became her next project. Rachel was tired of eating the same things every day. She started experimenting. She found wild plants growing in the jungle and tested them carefully. She would rub a small piece on her skin first to check for reactions. Then she would taste a tiny bit and wait several hours. If nothing bad happened, she would try a little more. This slow process saved her life more than once. Some plants made her sick, but she learned which ones were safe. She discovered a plant with roots that tasted almost like sweet potato when cooked. There were wild berries, though most were too sour to enjoy. She found leaves that could be boiled to make a tea that helped when her stomach was upset. The island was providing for her, but only because she was learning to read it like a book. Fishing became easier with practice. Rachel made a better spear by sharpening bamboo and hardening the tip in fire. She learned to stand very still in the shallow water and wait for fish to come close. Her accuracy improved. She also created a simple trap using stones arranged in a circle with a gap. Fish would swim in during high tide, and when the tide went out, they would be trapped in the pool. Rachel started a small garden near her shelter. She planted seeds from fruits she had eaten, not really expecting much. But to her amazement, some of them actually grew. She had a few papaya plants and something that looked like it might become a melon. Caring for these plants gave her a sense of purpose. Every morning she would check on them, pull weeds, and water them from her collection buckets. Water collection became sophisticated over time. Rachel had containers made from bamboo segments that she had carved out. She positioned them under spots where rainwater dripped from her roof. She also found a few plastic bottles that had washed up on the beach, which she cleaned and used for storage. She always kept at least 3 days of water supply just in case. The loneliness never completely went away, but Rachel found ways to cope with it. She talked out loud constantly, narrating what she was doing. She sang every song she could remember from her childhood. She made up stories and told them to the birds. Sometimes she would pretend she was teaching a class, explaining to invisible students how to survive on an island. It probably would have looked crazy to anyone watching, but it kept her mind active and her spirit from completely breaking. She created a workspace near her shelter where she made tools. She had a collection of sharp rocks for cutting, smooth stones for grinding, and pieces of driftwood in various shapes. She learned to make rope by twisting plant fibers together. It was tedious work, but the rope was useful for everything from tying things together to making fishing lines. Rachel also made clothing from woven palm leaves. Her first attempts were stiff and uncomfortable, but she got better at it. She created a simple dress that covered her body and protected her from the sun. She made a hat with a wide brim. She even made sandals, though they fell apart quickly, and she eventually gave up on footwear entirely. Her feet developed thick calluses that protected them naturally. Keeping track of time became important to her mental health. She continued marking her driftwood calendar every day, though she had lost count so many times that she wasn't sure of the actual date anymore. She estimated it had been about a year since the storm, maybe more. Her birthday had passed at some point. She was 30 now, or maybe 31. The uncertainty bothered her more than she expected. She found ways to mark special occasions. On what she thought might be her birthday, she caught an extra large fish and cooked it with some of the sweet root vegetables. She sang happy birthday to herself and made a wish on a flower instead of candles. It felt both sad and strangely hopeful at the same time. The island revealed more of its secrets as Rachel explored further. She found a small cave that stayed cool even during the hottest part of the day. She used it to store food that might spoil in the heat. She discovered a grove of trees that attracted lots of birds at dawn, which meant she could sometimes catch one for meat. She mapped out the best spots for finding shellfish and the areas to avoid because of strong currents. Rachel started keeping a journal using charcoal on flat pieces of driftwood and large leaves. She documented everything: what plants were edible, when certain fish appeared in the shallows, how to predict storms by watching the clouds. Part of her hoped someone would find these notes someday. Part of her was just creating a record because humans need to feel like their experiences matter, even if no one else ever knows about them. She wrote letters to her family on pieces of bark. Long letters telling them she was alive, that she thought about them every day, that she was sorry for all the worry she must have caused. She kept these letters in her shelter, lined up neatly on a bamboo shelf. She knew they would never be sent, but writing them made her feel connected to the world she had lost. There were still hard days. Days when depression hit so hard she couldn't get out of bed. Days when she screamed at the ocean, angry at fate for putting her here. Days when she cried until she had no tears left. But there were also good days. Days when she felt proud of something she had built. Days when the sunset was so beautiful it took her breath away. Days when she felt strong and capable and grateful to be alive. Rachel realized she had changed. The person who had been caught in that storm was gone. That Rachel had been soft, comfortable, used to having everything she needed within reach. This Rachel was harder, tougher, more resourceful. She had muscles she didn't know existed. She could start a fire in under 10 minutes. She could catch fish with her bare hands. She could predict weather patterns by the smell of the air. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and that made all the difference. Rachel was checking her fishing traps when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to her island. A mechanical hum that made her freeze in place. At first, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her again. It had happened before, especially during the first year. She would hear voices or music or engines only to realize it was just the wind or her desperate imagination. But this sound didn't fade away. It got louder. Rachel's heart started pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She dropped the fish she was holding and ran toward the beach, stumbling over roots and rocks in her hurry. Branches scratched her arms, but she didn't care. That sound meant only one thing: a boat. An actual boat with people on it. She burst out onto the beach and shielded her eyes from the bright sun. There it was. A white vessel, bigger than her research boat had been, maybe 100 yards offshore. It was moving slowly along the coast, and Rachel could see people on the deck. Real people. Not imagined. Not a dream. For a moment she couldn't move. She just stood there staring. Then panic set in. What if they didn't see her? What if they passed by without noticing the island? She started waving her arms frantically over her head, jumping up and down. She tried to yell, but her voice came out as a weak croak. She hadn't really used her full voice in so long, and now when she needed it most, it barely worked. Rachel ran back to her shelter and grabbed a piece of cloth she had made from woven fibers. It was the brightest thing she owned. She rushed back to the beach and waved it like a flag, shaking it back and forth, creating as much movement as possible. Come on, she thought desperately. Please see me. Please. On the boat, a man was looking through binoculars at the shoreline. He was part of a research team studying ocean currents and mapping underwater formations. They had noticed this tiny atoll wasn't properly marked on their charts, so they decided to take a closer look. He was scanning the beach when something caught his eye. Movement, and was that a person? He lowered the binoculars, blinked, and looked again. There was definitely someone on that beach. Someone waving frantically. His mind raced through possibilities. Local fishermen? Indigenous people? But this island was supposed to be uninhabited. He called out to the captain, excitement and confusion in his voice. The boat changed direction, heading toward the shore. Rachel watched it approach and felt her legs go weak. This was real. This was actually happening. She sat down hard on the sand, still holding her makeshift flag. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the salt spray from the ocean. 4 years. It had been more than 4 years since she had seen another human being. As the boat got closer, someone dropped an anchor, and a smaller inflatable boat was lowered into the water. 3 people climbed into it and started rowing toward shore. Rachel stood up again, wiping her face with her hands. She probably looked like a wild person. Her hair was long and tangled, bleached by the sun into a strange mixture of brown and blonde. Her skin was deeply tanned, almost leather-like. Her clothes were handmade from plant materials. She looked down at herself and almost laughed. What must she look like to them? The small boat reached the shallow water, and the 3 people got out, pulling it onto the beach. They stared at Rachel and she stared back. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then one of them, a woman with kind eyes, took a careful step forward. "Hello," the woman said gently, speaking in English. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" Rachel tried to answer, but her voice wouldn't work properly. She nodded instead, tears flowing again. The woman came closer and reached out slowly as if approaching a frightened animal. When her hand touched Rachel's shoulder, Rachel broke down completely. She sobbed like a child and the woman pulled her into a hug. "It's okay," the woman whispered. "You're safe now. We've got you." The other two researchers stood back talking quietly on a radio. They were calling the main vessel, reporting what they had found. A survivor. A woman alone on an uninhabited island. They had so many questions, but those could wait. Right now, this person needed water, food, and medical attention. When Rachel finally calmed down enough to speak, her voice was hoarse and rough. "My name is Rachel Torres," she said slowly. "I'm a marine biologist. My boat sank in a storm. I don't know what day it is. What year is it?" The woman's eyes widened. "It's October 2023, she said softly. Rachel did the math in her head. October 2023. She had disappeared in March 2019, 4 years and 7 months. She had lost count of the days somewhere along the way, but she had guessed it had been about 4 years. She was close. Knowing the actual number made it feel more real somehow. "My family," Rachel said urgently, gripping the woman's arm. "Do they think I'm dead? There was a search, right? They looked for me." The woman nodded, looking sad. "We'll contact the authorities right away. We'll get word to your family. But yes, after you went missing, there was a search. I'm sorry." "I'm sure everyone thought—" "I know," Rachel interrupted. She had known for a long time that the world had moved on without her. They offered her water from a plastic bottle, and Rachel drank it gratefully, amazed at how clean and pure it tasted. They gave her energy bars and fruit, real food in packages. It tasted strange after years of eating only what the island provided. Too sweet, too processed, but also wonderful. One of the men asked if she had shelter, and Rachel nodded, gesturing toward the tree line. "I built a place. Do you want to see it?" They followed her through the jungle to her shelter. When they saw what she had created, they stopped and stared. The structure was impressive, with solid walls, a waterproof roof, organized storage areas, and even a garden nearby. There were tools arranged neatly, a fire pit with stones arranged around it, and those pieces of bark with writing on them. "You built all this yourself?" one of them asked, amazement in his voice. Rachel nodded, feeling a strange mix of pride and sadness. This place had been her whole world for so long. Every piece of bamboo, every woven wall, every tool represented hours of work and problem-solving. It was proof that she had survived, that she had adapted. But it was also proof of how alone she had been. The woman picked up one of the bark letters and read it. It was addressed to Rachel's mother. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Your family is going to be so happy," she said quietly. They never gave up hope, I'm sure of it. Rachel wanted to believe that. But she also knew the reality. After 4.5 years, people move on. They have to. Her family had probably held a funeral. They had probably packed up her apartment, donated her things, and tried to heal. Finding out she was alive would be wonderful, yes. But it would also be a shock that turned their lives upside down all over again. The researchers asked if she wanted to take anything with her, and Rachel looked around her shelter. She picked up the piece of driftwood where she had carved her calendar marks. She grabbed the letters she had written to her family. She took one of her handmade tools, a knife she had shaped from stone and wood. These things represented who she had become on this island. As they walked back to the beach, Rachel turned to look at her shelter one more time. A part of her felt like she was betraying it somehow, leaving it behind after it had protected her for so long. But another part of her was ready to go. She was ready to see her family, to sleep in a real bed, to have a conversation that didn't involve talking to herself. The team helped her into the small boat, and they rowed back to the research vessel. The other crew members gathered on deck, staring at this woman who had survived alone for more than 4 years. Someone wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Someone else brought her more water. The captain was on the radio, talking urgently to authorities. Rachel sat on the deck wrapped in the blanket and watched her island get smaller as the boat pulled away. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful. She had watched thousands of sunsets from that beach, but this one felt different. This was the sunset that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. She was going home. After all this time, she was finally going home. The phone call came at 3 in the morning. Rachel's mother was asleep when it rang, and her first thought was annoyance at being woken up. Then she saw it was an unknown international number. Her heart jumped. Strange calls at odd hours were never good news. She answered with a shaky voice. "Mrs. Torres? This is Commander Chen from the Indonesian Maritime Rescue Service. I need you to sit down. I have news about your daughter Rachel." Rachel's mother felt the room spin. After 4.5 years, she had learned to live with the loss. The grief had become a constant companion, something she carried with her every day but had learned to function around. Now this call was ripping open wounds she thought had scarred over. "We found her," the commander said quickly, hearing her sharp intake of breath. "She's alive. Your daughter is alive and safe." Rachel's mother dropped the phone. Her husband woke up, confused, asking what was wrong. She couldn't speak. She just pointed at the phone lying on the floor. He picked it up and listened to the commander repeat the impossible news. Rachel was alive. She had been found on a small island. She was thin and weathered but remarkably healthy. They were bringing her to a hospital in Jakarta for evaluation, and then she would be flown home. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was all over television and social media. Marine biologist Rachel Torres, missing and presumed dead for over 4 years, found alive on remote island. The story seemed impossible, like something from a movie. Reporters camped outside the Torres family home. Everyone wanted to know how she survived, what she ate, how she stayed sane. But Rachel herself was struggling with something nobody had considered. Coming back to civilization was harder than surviving on the island had been. Everything was overwhelming. The hospital in Jakarta was too bright, too noisy, too full of people. Doctors and nurses came in and out constantly, poking her, taking blood samples, asking questions. She understood they were trying to help, but she felt like an animal in a zoo. The food made her sick. After years of eating simple, fresh food, her stomach couldn't handle processed meals. The bread was too soft, the vegetables tasted like chemicals, and everything had too much salt or sugar. She asked for plain rice and fish, which helped, but even that felt strange. Nothing tasted the way she remembered. Sleep was impossible. The bed was too soft. The sheets felt wrong against her skin. The air conditioning was too cold. She kept getting up and lying on the floor, which made the nurses worry. At night, she missed the sound of waves and the rustling of palm trees. The hospital sounds, beeping machines, and footsteps in hallways kept her awake for hours. The hardest part was being around people. Rachel had spent 4.5 years alone, and now she was never alone. Someone was always watching her, checking on her, asking if she needed anything. She wanted to scream at them to leave her alone, but she knew they meant well. She felt guilty for not being more grateful. Everyone expected her to be happy and relieved, and she was, but she was also exhausted and confused and scared. When she finally saw her family, it was both wonderful and terrible. Her mother hugged her so tight Rachel could barely breathe, crying and saying her name over and over. Her father stood behind them, tears streaming down his face. Her younger brother, who had been just 22 when she disappeared, was now 27 and looked so different. They all looked older. Time had passed for them too. They asked her a million questions. What happened? How did you survive? Were you scared? Did you ever give up hope? Rachel tried to answer, but the words felt inadequate. How could she explain 4.5 years in a conversation? How could she describe the loneliness, the small victories, the person she had become? Flying back home was surreal. Rachel sat by the window watching the ocean pass beneath them. Somewhere down there was her island. From up here it was invisible, just a tiny dot in an endless blue. She wondered if her shelter was still standing, if the plants in her garden would keep growing, if anyone would ever see what she had built. The media attention was intense. Everyone wanted to interview her. Publishers offered her money to write a book. Movie producers called wanting to make her story into a film. Rachel's family tried to protect her, but it was impossible to escape completely. She was famous in a way she had never wanted to be. A psychologist who specialized in trauma came to see her. Dr. Kim was gentle and patient, never pushing too hard. She explained that what Rachel was experiencing was normal. After years of isolation and survival mode, readjusting to normal life would take time. The anxiety, the trouble sleeping, the feeling of being overwhelmed, these were all expected responses. "You went through something most people can't imagine," Dr. Kim said during one session. "Don't expect yourself to just snap back to who you were before. That person doesn't exist anymore. You need to figure out who you are now." That hit Rachel hard because it was true. She wasn't the same person who had sailed out that day in March 2019. That Rachel had been confident and optimistic, someone who saw the ocean as a friend. This Rachel was harder, more cautious, more aware of how quickly everything could fall apart. She had learned that she could survive anything, but she had also learned how fragile life really was. Months passed. Rachel moved into a small apartment by herself, which helped. Being alone felt more natural than being constantly surrounded by people. She started writing about her experience, not because publishers were offering money, but because she needed to process what had happened. The words came slowly at first, but then faster. She wrote about the storm, about learning to fish, about the shelter she built, about talking to herself to stay sane. Her book came out a year after her rescue. She called it "The Island Inside Me" because that's what it felt like. The island hadn't just been a place where she lived. It had become part of who she was. Reading her own story in print was strange. It felt like reading about someone else's life. Rachel used the money from the book to start a foundation focused on ocean conservation and maritime safety. If her story could help make the ocean safer for other researchers, then maybe her ordeal had meaning beyond just survival. She gave talks at universities, teaching young scientists about safety protocols and emergency preparedness. She showed them the tools she had made, explained how she had solved problems, and always emphasized that preparation had saved her life. She went back to work as a marine biologist, but she never went on solo trips again. The ocean still fascinated her, but the relationship had changed. She respected its power more now. She had seen what it could do, felt its strength firsthand. When she went diving, she was always aware of exit points, always had backup plans, always let someone know exactly where she would be. 2 years after her rescue, Rachel met someone. His name was David, and he was the environmental engineer who worked on coastal restoration projects. He had read her book and came to one of her talks. They started talking after the event and didn't stop for 3 hours. What she liked most about him was that he didn't treat her like a survivor or a celebrity. He just treated her like a person. David understood when she needed space. He didn't ask too many questions about the island unless she wanted to talk about it. He was patient with her quirks, like her need to keep emergency supplies in every room, or her habit of waking up early to watch the sunrise. He made her laugh, which she had forgotten how to do for a while. They got married in a small ceremony on a beach. Not the beach where she had been rescued, but a different one, a place with no bad memories. As Rachel stood there with her feet in the sand, feeling the wind on her face and listening to the waves, she thought about how far she had come, not just physically from that island, but emotionally from the terrified woman who had washed up on shore. She kept that piece of driftwood with the carved calendar marks in her home, displayed on a shelf. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and she would tell them a shortened version of the story. But mostly it was just for her, a reminder of what she had endured, what she had built, who she had been when everything else was stripped away. The island was officially named on maritime charts now. They called it Rachel's Refuge. She had mixed feelings about that. Part of her was honored. Part of her wished it could have remained anonymous, just hers, but she supposed it didn't really matter. The island had served its purpose. It had kept her alive when nothing else could. Rachel's life wasn't perfect. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still felt anxious in crowds. She still struggled with the loss of those 4.5 years, time she could never get back. But she had also gained something. She had discovered a strength she never knew existed. She had learned that humans can adapt to almost anything. She had found out what really mattered when everything else was gone. On the 5th anniversary of her rescue, Rachel stood on a beach and looked out at the ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water in golds and pinks. She thought about the woman she had been before the storm, young and naive. She thought about the woman she had become on the island, tough and resourceful. And she thought about who she was now, someone who carried both of those people inside her. The ocean had taken so much from her, but in a strange way it had also given her something back. It had shown her what she was made of. And that, she realized, was a gift not everyone gets. A terrible gift, maybe, but a gift nonetheless.